Jeff Tsai from Forte again. So the last video that we did focused on really coordinating the blade and footwork actions, right? How do you actually do those and put them all together so you can attack effectively? So this next video we're going to do is how do you defend? So what are some basic defenses? And at a very sort of broad level, just like with the cuts, we really kind of focused on movement with attacking rather than sort of like cutting and coming to a stop every time. We made a distinction between sort of like more continuous as opposed to more discrete movement there. So we're going to do a similar thing here, especially for beginners. I do think it is sort of easier to sort of teach these defenses where you come to a stop. We'll call those, say, static defenses. So we're going to introduce the idea of a couple of positions that are really good for these stopping positions called Ochs and Plough. Ochs in German and Pflug in German for ox and plow. And then we'll actually talk about doing that more dynamically after we see that there are some potential pitfalls in terms of doing things purely statically or discretely coming to a stop. Okay, so I'm gonna have Brandon come in here. So Brandon is going to be basically doing the basic attack fundamentals that we did before, half cuts with the so-called forward or long edge of the blade basically to my head. And I'm going to be starting with Ochs to do parries and then Plough to do parries. Okay, and you'll notice also when I do these parries, even though I am coming to a stop, it is still with basically one parry, one step. So this is me parrying with Ochs on the inside, the opponent's inside. And then I can also parry on the opponent's outside. Okay, and then same thing with Plough. Inside, parrying on the opponent's inside. Or on the outside, which is a lot scarier. Right? If I guess wrong, I'm basically parrying in a way where I'm parallel to the opponent's blade. Okay, and that's pretty scary and dangerous. So a slightly next step on this is to actually have Brandon randomize what he's going to do. So he's not always going to alternate as he had been, but actually, sometimes he's going to attack me more than one time on the same side. Okay, so go ahead, and I have to guess now, right? I'm trying to make sure that I'm covered. Right, so Ochs, not so bad. Now Plough, okay, again, every time I'm trying to parry on the inside, get away. But there's sometimes like this, where if I'm trying to parry on the outside, it's very difficult not to get hit if I make that wrong choice. Right, so especially with Plough, it is difficult to always make the right choice. So as you can see, like there are times when I make that wrong choice. If you cut from the right, and instead of doing this, I come here, right? That's the really dangerous. I can parry it and be safe, but it is much trickier. So the sort of like cost of making an incorrect choice in terms of the so-called discrete or static parry can be pretty high, especially for Plough. And so there's the whole notion of like, hey, wouldn't it be great if there were a parry of some sort where, like, even if I made the wrong choice, there's kind of a backup plan, something that you can flow into that still works really, really well. And so everything, as I said, we were talking about sort of like these discrete or static parries. Now let's talk about an example of, just like with cuts, sort of dynamic, continuous flowing motions that are used for defense, right? So I'm going to show a motion, a movement that is effectively, actually I'm not going to name it just yet, but I'm going to show you basically what it looks like. So go ahead. So I'm gonna have Brandon alternate his attacks. Again, it's to the head, here, here, here. And you're gonna notice, again, I'm gonna do one parry per step, but unlike the so-called discrete or static parries, these will continue to move. I'm gonna move through each one of these parries. And you'll notice as I do these parries, there's pressure I'm able to put on the blade and push it down and away. Okay, all right, great. So now that we've kind of seen that in action a little bit, so now I'll put a name to it. So this is our approach on what we believe is the crooked cut, or the Krumphau from the German tradition. Okay, so so if I have Brandon actually throwing his cuts, and we're actually going to not touch for a second. So go ahead and throw your cut. I'm basically stepping away from the cut, just like before when I was doing with Plough or Ochs or whatever. Either step away from a cut or step behind it, right? So here I'm going to step away from it, and I'm just going to come not this way from the right, but actually cross over to the left and basically do this motion. Okay? And I'm just going to do that, alternating on both sides. And that's very important, this alternating concept. I'm doing that automatically. I am consistently just saying, I'm going to do one side, other side, one side, other side. Can I continue on the same side? Yes, but by kind of setting that as a default assumption, that allows me to like be continuous and not have get stuck in terms of like having to do extra sort of like thinking to the next thing, right? So Brandon right now has been just alternating attacks. Brandon is going to go ahead and basically throw alternating Zornhaus from right and left. And as a default, I'm going to do alternating crumps every single time. And every once in a while, he will throw in an attack from the same side twice and see what happens where, you know, if I, you know, what happens when I guess wrong, right? So I'm trying to crump to one side, but when I actually end up crumping to the sort of incorrect side, what happens, right? Is it catastrophic failure? Hopefully not, so here we go. So, crump. Right, so right there. So I was about to do a crump on this side, stepping this way, and then there was a second attack from this side, so this actually turned into this, where the hands actually were just right in line with an attack, right? So if Brandon keeps going, so all of a sudden this pattern has turned into this guy. And if at some point Brandon throws another double, then we go back to crump. And now we're back into that other pattern. Yep, and back to crump. Yep, crump, 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 double, shield. So here, shield. If you look at it just from kind of down the line here, so here's what it looks like, you know, if you're the one throwing cuts towards me, I'm going to step away from the cut from the right, this way, step away, and then I'm going to step into a cut from this side if you double. This becomes shield then. And I think also the thing that's a little unusual about this version of the shield is that you're actually stepping into the cut, which I think is really interesting. And kind of gets to this whole idea of like, we are, as part of like us kind of figuring out a lot of these additional interesting mechanics that are worth talking about, we have explored a lot of combinations and permutations that go beyond what is potentially talked about. Or not even that it's not talked about. I think there are examples that are documented of what we're talking about, but it may not be common knowledge. It might be stuff that is actually kind of in some of the harder to understand sources like Paulus Hector Meyer, or buried in some of like Joachim Meyer's type stuff. So I think there's a lot more in the historical record that we've been able to kind of look at, and there's sort of like these additional permutations of mechanics that are worth kind of looking at, including a shield where you're not just always going away from a cut from the right, but actually potentially stepping into it. Okay. The takeaway there, hopefully, is that this kind of crump mechanic flows one parry every step. I can do this going forward, going backward, just like cuts. And even if I guess wrong and I'm stepping into an attack instead of away from an attack, that turns into sort of an alternate parry, which is basically the Schiel, the Squinting Cut from the German tradition. So, okay, so we've talked about static parries and then an example of dynamic parries. And the exercise that you're kind of seeing us do here is something that we're about to talk about in the final video, which we sort of affectionately call a couple of different things, but basically a Frequens Motus drill, right? A drill that really helps us develop flow, both as the attacker and the defender, and then ultimately being able to kind of flow back and forth those two different roles. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit and see, you know, again, what the dynamics of that are and how do those compare to, you know, what other people tend to do in HEMA, and like, can this be an addition to the dynamics that you tend to see, and does it yield to some interesting results both in fencing and interpretation?